Welcome to the first visual studies tutorial for the course Framing the Photographic. For this tutorial, you were asked to prepare the reading Who is Speaking Thus by Abigail Solomon-Godeau. Abigail Solomon-Godeau's text is an oldie, but it's definitely a goodie. It's a text that, while it was written in 1987, is constantly being referred to by contemporary authors on the topic of photography and specifically the ethics of photographic representation. What her text does is look at what documentary photography is, what its origins are, and what we now understand documentary photography to be. Solomon-Godeau suggests that this notion of documentary photography is a historical concept that speaks to specifically a genre of photography. As we've discussed in class, we see the medium of photography as essentially objective, that its natural state of being is to record reality, to be a trace of the real. This ability for photographs to essentially record the present and keep it for posterity is tied specifically to its indexical nature. What we find with photography, that the photographer is often invisible, that the image looks as if it's been made from nothing or been made by no one, that instead it looks like it's made itself. This is what Solomon-Godeau refers to as the transparency of photography. The medium is invisible. We do not see or recognize that a photograph has been made, that it is manufactured or constructed. The hand of the maker that we so often see when we look at paintings or sculpture, when we recognize that there was an artist involved in the creation, this artist, this maker, this creator seems invisible when it comes to photography. So this is one of the elements of photography that see it function quite naturally as a medium to document the real, to document reality. Solomon-Godeau argues that it's not only this nature of the medium, but also the fact that the medium was used specifically to document at very particular points in time. Solomon-Godeau specifically highlights an important moment of documentary photography, namely its use by Jacob Riis in an attempt to reform the slums of Britain. So what we find is that the medium of photography is being used by a journalist, by a reporter, and is thus being put to very particular use. It's being used to communicate the real experiences of others to an audience. So when you think about the aesthetics of documentary photography, what we're really thinking about is a set of visual rules that govern the look and feel of an image, in this case, a photograph. One such aesthetic is known as the realist aesthetic, and this is the look and feel of the photographs of Jacob Riis. The photographs of Jacob Riis are an example of realist photography, in that they appear spontaneous and unplanned. They embody this notion that Solomon-Godeau calls the transparent nature of the medium, and they have a high truth value, meaning that they appear to be a direct trace of reality. They appear wholly objective, and the photographer appears to not have influenced the scene that he depicts. Now, the realist aesthetic is something we can see in this example, in the kind of gritty look of the photograph, the fact that areas of it are overexposed and other areas are underexposed, meaning that there are some areas where it is too white, too bright, and other areas where it's just too dark, and elements or details of the photograph become blurry or fade into darkness or into these white areas. We also have evidence of movement, so a couple of the figures are blurred because the photograph was taken while they were in motion, and as a result they aren't clearly depicted. The fact that one man looks over his shoulder as if surprised by the presence of the photographer and his camera, another seems like he hasn't even noticed that the photographer is present, while another woman seems to look at the camera lens, smiling, prepared to have her photograph taken. These various elements of the photograph, along with the fact that it doesn't feel like anything's been posed, the composition feels a little bit messy, it doesn't look like any people or any objects have been strategically placed in a particular area of the room. It feels like the photographer simply walked in, saw a scene, took a photograph, and walked away. These elements all add to the realist aesthetic. The photograph communicates a moment of action that is captured as it was encountered by the photographer. In comparison, other forms of documentary photography, here for instance in the photograph by Dorothea Lange, shows how documentary photographs can don a very different aesthetic, can be indeed more stylized, can have almost an artistic quality to them, unlike the realist aesthetic that feels quite sudden and immediate and unplanned. The aesthetic used by Dorothea Lange indicates a certain set of stylistic choices. For instance, the fact that the two children look directly at the viewer and thus at the camera and the photographer indicate their knowledge that they are about to be photographed. They also seem more prepared, like they are allowing their photos to be taken. They're looking directly at us, their hands clasped around their faces, both of them taking a very similar pose. What we also find is that compositionally, the photograph is quite balanced. The two children are almost in the center of the photograph. There's even space around each one of them. Certain decisions seem to have been made in relation to the focal point of the image, the focus itself. The two children are very clear. Detail can be seen in their faces, the dirt on their hands, the freckles on their skin, the lightness of their hair, this kind of pleading look in their eyes is all very clear, all very sharp. In comparison, the background is blurred. It's out of focus, which to a large extent highlights the two figures, the two children, who look out at the viewer almost mournfully, longingly. And to a large extent, these kinds of aesthetic choices made by photographers are often motivated by the wish for the photographs to have an emotional appeal. We see, as I've already discussed, an attention to composition, to pose. It's entirely possible that these two children were asked to pose in this particular way by the photographer. So while the photograph appears to relay a kind of truthful representation of the scene, it is entirely possible that Lange, as a photographer, asked them to position themselves in this way. So while we can, at least on some level, recognize that the photographer is present, that her hand was part of the making of this image, possibly asking the children to pose, possibly changing the focus of her camera in order to make sure they were sharp, whereas the background was blurred. This image still has an incredibly high truth value because it seems to document the everyday experience, a moment in time of the lives of these two children. A very important element of Solomon-Godeau's argument is her discussion of subjugation, and more specifically what she calls a double act of subjugation that she suggests documentary photographs take part in. This double act of subjugation is something very specific to Solomon-Godeau. It speaks to the power relation between the photographer, the viewer, and those who are depicted in the documentary photograph. What we have, for instance, in the work of Jacob Rie, is quite an obvious power relation. We have a middle-class man who bursts into the rooms of lower working-class citizens, who takes them by surprise, who photographs them without their consent, and who reproduces those photographs for other middle-class individuals to look at, to engage. While it is done with a reformist attitude or with reformist intention, in other words, to help the people that he photographs, we still have an unequal power relation in that the individuals depicted have no say over their images, over how they are represented and who gets to see their representations. While a photograph like that of Lange's might seem to be less exploitative because the individuals are depicted in a more aesthetically pleasing light. The children look more attractive, they're beautifully posed, the lighting is soft and gentle, there's something quite pleasing about the image. What we still find is that there's an element of objectification that happens in both Rie and Lange's photographs. An element of objectification that essentially turns viewers into voyeurs. Now, voyeurism, and when we think about voyeurism, it's this idea of looking without being looked at in return, or not having one's own gaze challenged, or the idea of seeing something that should rather be left unseen, something that is private. What we find, even with images like Lange's, is that the lives of the individuals depicted, in this case the two children, are exposed to the viewer as a spectacle. The photograph is no longer about them as individuals, but about their troubles, about their circumstance. And as a result, the children become emblematic of a greater struggle, rather than individuals. But this double act of subjugation is something very specific to Solomon-Godeau. And she sees this double act of subjugation as inherent to all documentary photography, not just to the work of Rie or the work of Lange. When she defines the double act of subjugation, what she's speaking to is the idea that there are two moments in which these vulnerable individuals are essentially victimized. The first level is that society has victimized these individuals, that they are of low economic status, and as a result, that they are disempowered within that given society. They are the poor, the sick, the downtrodden, those without power within that given society. Arguably, and this is where the second act of subjugation takes place for Solomon-Godeau, is that because photographs freeze the single moment in time, that the photograph essentially continues to trap these individuals in the status of victim, that they put their victimhood on display for eternity, and that any other element to their lives, their hopes, their dreams, their ability to lift themselves up out of their circumstance, is done away with, and all that is left is this image of the victim. So what Solomon-Godeau essentially asks us to do in Who is Speaking Thus is she asks us to look critically at documentary photography. Her question, Who is Speaking Thus, is an attempt to help us recognize that photographs are always spoken. They are the products of their context because they are spoken within a particular historical frame. They don't come from nowhere, but rather the place, the time, the ideologies that surround their production matter. Even when the photographer is invisible, even when the medium is transparent, we need to recognize that there's always someone behind the image. There's always someone in charge of the meaning of those photographs. Someone who pushes the button, someone who chooses what to include and what to exclude. Finally, our belief in their truthfulness is something that is learned. It is not inherent to the medium, but rather we have come to believe in photographs as neutral, objective representations of reality.